The wind in Split Rock, Wyoming territory, did not just blow, it scoured. It came off the high plains with a sound like a blade being sharpened, carrying ice and the grit of 1,000 empty miles. It found the single passenger who stepped off the westbound train, a woman dressed in the stark black of a new widow. The wool of her dress was fine but worn thin at the cuffs, and the veil she held against her face was more for hiding than for grief. Her name was Mary Lou Hayes. She held her carpetbag in one gloved hand, her knuckles white. She had been on the cars for 9 days, trading the damp chill of Ohio for this high, dry, killing cold. The town was little more than a scar of muddy, frozen ruts along the railway line. 3 saloons, a hotel, a livery, and the low-slung building she was looking for. The sign above its door, creaking on frozen hinges, read, U.S. Land Office. She pulled her coat tighter. It was a flimsy thing, meant for a different life. She crossed the street, her boots finding no purchase on the slick, icy boards of the walkway. For a moment, she paused, her breath pluming in front of her. This was it, the end of the line, the sum of all her running. She pushed the door open. The office was hot and smelled of stale tobacco and unwashed men. A pot-bellied stove in the corner glowed a dull red. 2 men looked up from a table spread with maps. One was a broad man with a tin star pinned to a heavy wool coat. The other was thin, dressed in a fraying suit, his face pinched and sallow. "Ma'am," the man in the suit said, not standing. "What can we do for you?" "I am Mary Lou Hayes," she said. Her voice was steady, though her throat was tight. "I am here to claim the parcel filed by my uncle, Mr. Jedediah Stone. He passed. I have the will." She laid the papers on the counter. The suited man, Judge Hemlock, picked them up with 2 fingers. He read slowly, his lips moving. The man with the star, Sheriff Clanton, leaned over his shoulder, chewing on a matchstick. Clanton grunted. "Jed Stone, that old coot finally froze. Did he? Left his claim to you?" "He did," Mary Lou said. Judge Hemlock tapped the paper. "These papers seem in order. The will is filed proper, but there's a problem with the claim itself." A cold fist, colder than the wind outside, clenched in Mary Lou's stomach. "What problem?" "This parcel," Hemlock said, tracing a square on the map, "was filed under the Timber Culture Act. Requires a man to plant 10 acres of trees, maintain the property, build a life." He looked up, his eyes small and wet. "The territorial legislature, in its wisdom, requires a household to maintain such a claim, a family." "I am my family," Mary Lou said. Sheriff Clanton laughed, a short, barking sound. "A woman alone ain't a household. Ma'am, she's just alone. The claim's invalid as it stands. You ain't married." The heat in the room was suddenly suffocating. "That cannot be. The will is clear." "The will is fine," Hemlock said, showing yellow teeth in a smile. "You own the right to the claim. You just can't keep the claim, not without a husband to act as head of household. It lapses in 7 days." 7 days. She had spent her last dollar on the train ticket. "Now," Clanton said, leaning on the counter. His voice dropped, became almost friendly. "You find yourself in a bind. A woman like you, new in town, winter coming on." He gestured to the window, where the first flakes of snow were beginning to swirl in the street. "Judge and I, we know a fella, Mr. Barrows, respectable man. He's been looking at that parcel. He might be persuaded to take it off your hands, save you the trouble, say $50. Mary Lou looked at the map. 640 acres of prime bottomland, according to her uncle's letters, worth thousands, even here. $50 was an insult. It was theft. "I am not selling," she said. Hemlock sighed. Theatrical. "Then I suggest you find yourself a man, Mrs. Hayes, and fast. This town ain't kind to lone women, especially lone women with property they can't hold." "It's Miss," she said, the lie tasting like ash. "My husband died before It was all very sudden." Clanton's eyes ran over her, from the hem of her dress to the pale skin of her throat. "A widow, then. A shame. Well, the offer stands. 7 days." Mary Lou snatched the papers from the counter. Her hands were shaking now, not with cold, but with a deep, furious rage. She had not come this far, endured so much, to be cheated by 2 small-town thieves. She turned and walked out, her back straight. She did not slam the door, but the force of her will shut it with a definitive click. The sound of their laughter followed her into the biting wind. She stood on the walkway, her hope draining away, leaving a hollow, terrified space behind. 7 days. She had no money for the hotel pass tonight, no one to turn to, and nowhere else to run. The wind ripped the veil from her grasp and flattened her hair against her skull. She was trapped. She needed to think. She needed food. The only place still serving, the sign said, was the Silver Dollar Saloon. A woman alone did not enter such a place. Mary Lou Hayes, the woman she was pretending to be, would rather starve. But the woman she was, the one who had clawed her way across half a continent, was desperate. She pulled her veil down and pushed through the bat-wing doors. The saloon was a wall of noise, heat, and the rank smell of wet wool, sour whiskey, and frying fat. Every man at the bar and the tables stopped, turning to stare. She ignored them, walking to the darkest, most distant corner table. A man in a dirty apron came over. "Coffee," she said, her voice muffled by the veil. "And stew, if you have it." He nodded, surprised, and left. She kept her back to the wall, watching the room. Her terror had cooled into a hard, watchful state. She listened. The talk was of cattle prices, the coming storm, and a local dispute. Then, from a table near the bar, she caught a name. "Carver's in town," a man in a buffalo coat said. His companion spat a stream of tobacco juice toward the cuspidor. "Figured Clanton would have run him off by now." "Clanton won't go near him, not since Carver laid out those 3 railroad men. Man's got the devil's own luck, or he is the devil." "He ain't a murderer." A third, older man chimed in, his voice quiet. "Not rightly. Those men he killed? They lynched his little brother. Ben strung him up for stealing a horse he'd already paid for. Vigilante justice. They called it. Carver called it revenge. Hunted 'em down. One by one. All 3. Didn't use a gun on the last one." "They tried to hang him, too," the first man added, his voice low with a mix of fear and admiration. "Rope scarred him up good, face and neck, but the rope broke. He just walked away. No one's hired him since. No one'll talk to him. He just sits." Mary Lou's gaze followed the man's nod. In the far back corner, away from the stove, a man sat alone. He was big, his shoulders broad under a worn sheepskin coat. He was staring into a beer glass. Though it looked empty, he did not look at the room. He seemed to be absorbing the noise and the hate, turning it into the same cold stillness that lived outside. She could see the scar. It started near his temple, a puckered, angry red line that ran down his cheek and disappeared into the high collar of his shirt. It pulled the corner of his mouth into a permanent, grim set. He wasn't dangerous, she thought. He looked done. He looked the way she felt. An outcast, a man no one would hire, a man with nothing to lose. The stew arrived. She ate, forcing the hot, greasy liquid down. An idea wild and terrifying began to form. It was madness. It was suicide. It was, perhaps, her only choice. She finished her stew. She paid the man, her last coins clinking on the wood. She stood up. The saloon watched her. A woman walking to a table was one thing. A woman walking toward Eli Carver was another. She stopped at his table. His shadow fell over him, but he did not look up. "Mr. Carver?" He raised his head slowly. His eyes were the color of the sky outside, a flat, cold gray. They held no welcome, no curiosity, only exhaustion. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together. "I have a business proposition for you." The saloon noise died. Men leaned in, straining to hear. Carver looked past her, at the bar, at the men watching. He looked back at her. Outside. He stood, and he was taller than she'd thought. He towered over her, a wall of cold leather and wool. He tossed a nickel on the table and walked toward the door, not waiting to see if she followed. She did. The street was darker. The wind was a physical blow. The snow was beginning to stick. He stopped in the lee of the livery wall, turning to face her. He did not cross his arms. He just waited. "They're cheating me," she said, the words tumbling out, driven by the wind. "The sheriff and the judge. I have a land claim, 640 acres. It's mine, left by my uncle, but they say it's invalid unless I'm married." Carver's expression did not change. So I need a husband. They've given me 7 days." She took a breath, the cold burning her lungs. "I'm proposing a deal. You marry me, in name only." He stared at her for a long, silent moment. The only sound was the howl of the wind. Then a low, dry chuckle rumbled in his chest. It was a sound with no humor in it. "You walk into a saloon," he said, his voice flat. "You pick the one man in town everyone's afraid of, the one man no one will even look at, and you offer marriage." "I heard what they said," she countered, her voice rising to meet the wind. "They said no one will hire you. They said you're an outcast. Well, so am I. This land is all I have. It's a chance. For both of us. You help me hold the land for 1 year. Just 1 year. Maintain the claim. At the end of the year, I'll sign over half of it to you. 320 acres. Free and clear." She waited. He was studying her face, his gaze moving over her veil, her eyes. "No expectations," she added, her voice dropping, suddenly desperate for him to understand. "It is a business arrangement. No touching. We live as partners. Nothing more." His gaze sharpened. "What's wrong with you? Why are you an outcast? A woman with land, even with trouble, could find a man. Why me?" "Because you," she said, "won't want anything more. You, I can trust to keep the bargain." "You don't know the first thing about me, ma'am," he said, "and I don't sign on to deals with secrets. Secrets get men killed. Who are you running from?" "That isn't part of the deal," she said, her old defiance flaring. "It is now." He straightened up from the wall, turning to leave. "I ain't interested in being your shield, just to get shot in the back by whoever's chasing you." "Wait!" she cried. He stopped, his back to her. "Please, I'm not who I say I am. I'm not a widow. My name isn't even Hayes." He turned back, slowly. "I'm running," she whispered, the words torn from her. "From my family, back east. I brought shame on them. They cast me out. There's no bounty hunter. There's no husband. There's just me. I'm alone, just like you." He looked at her for a long time. The snow gathered on the shoulders of his coat and on the brim of his hat. He saw the truth in her eyes. It was not the whole truth. She knew he could see that, but it was enough. It was not the law. "They'll chew you up, little bird," he said, his voice softer, but no warmer. "This place, Clanton, Hemlock, they'll chew you up and spit you out. You and me both." "Then let them try," she said, lifting her chin. "I'm not asking for a protector, Mr. Carver. I'm offering a partnership, 320 acres, a home." He looked away, toward the dark, empty plains that surrounded the town. He thought of his shack. He thought of the frost on the inside of the walls. He thought of the way the livery owner had looked at his scar that morning and said, "We ain't hiring." He looked back at her. I'll think on it. He walked away, not toward the saloon, but into the growing storm, a large, dark shape that was quickly swallowed by the falling snow. Mary Lou was left alone, shaking, her last desperate gamble thrown into the void. Eli Carver did not sleep. His shack, built of sod and driftwood on the edge of the creek, was little more than a windbreak. The wind found every crack. He lay on his thin cot, covered by one blanket, and watched the frost spread on the walls. He had tried to get work. For 2 months, he'd offered to muck stalls, split wood, ride fence, but the scar on his face and the one on his neck, the thick, ropey brand of a hangman's noose, spoke before he could. The men he'd killed had been popular. His brother, Ben, was forgotten. He was starving, not fast, but slow. The cold was eating him alive. And then this woman, this Mary Lou Hayes, she was lying. He knew the look of a person running hard. He'd worn it himself for a year. She was scared, but she wasn't scared of him. That was the part that stuck. She had looked at his face, heard the stories, and seen a tool, an opportunity. 320 acres. A place to build a cabin that the wind couldn't find. A place to put a horse. A place where no man could tell him to move on. It was a risk. Her secrets were deep, and they were the kind that brought men with guns. But staying here, in this shack, with Clanton waiting for him to get weak enough to arrest, that wasn't a risk. It was a certainty. It was a slow-motion execution. He made his decision just as the first gray light of dawn turned the frost on his window blue. He found her at the boarding house. She was in the lobby, her bag at her feet. She was arguing with the proprietor, who was shaking his head. She had no more money. She was being thrown out. "I'll do it," Eli said from the doorway. Mary Lou turned. The proprietor froze. The hope that flared in her eyes was so bright it was painful, but it was immediately followed by a wave of pure terror. Eli stepped into the room. He ignored the proprietor, who suddenly found something fascinating to look at behind his desk. "I'll do it," Eli repeated, stopping a few feet from her. "On my condition." "I told you," she whispered. "My family." "The whole truth," he said. "I won't be ambushed. I walk into this with my eyes open, or I don't walk at all." She looked at her bag. She looked at the door, where the storm was now a howling white sheet. She looked at Eli. "Back home," she said, her voice so low he had to lean in. I was not married. I fell in love. Or I thought I did. He was a preacher's son. He left, and I was with child." She said it flat, like a sentence. "My family, my father, he is a powerful man. He said I had disgraced them. They cast me out. The baby—" Her voice broke, just for a second. "The baby died. On the road. I've been running ever since. My uncle's will was the first good news I'd had in a year. There is no one coming for me. Mr. Carver, I promise you, I am unclean. I am alone." He watched her. He saw the shame, the grief, and the iron will that had gotten her this far. It was not the law. It was just life, and life was meaner than the law. "All right," he said. He believed her. "We do it today, before Hemlock and Clanton file a challenge." "Where? How?" "The church. Pastor Gideon. He's a drunk, but the vows will be legal. And he owes me a favor." Eli picked up her bag. "Let's go." The church was a small, clapboard building that leaned to the north. Inside, it was colder than the street. It smelled of mildew and old wine. Pastor Gideon was standing at the bare altar, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his Bible. He was a small man, watery-eyed and desperate for his next drink. The only other people present were 2 men Eli had dragged out of the silver dollar, promising them a full bottle for their signatures. They were already sharing it in the back pew, snickering. Mary Lou stood beside Eli. She was trembling so hard her teeth chattered. Her black widow's dress felt like a sacrilegious mockery. This was a holy place, and she was bringing her lies into it. Eli stood next to her, solid as a mountain. He smelled of pine smoke, cold leather, and the faintest hint of whiskey. He was a stranger, and in a moment, he would be her husband. Pastor Gideon began to read, his voice slurring over the holy words. "Do you, Mary Lou Hayes, take this man, Eli Carver, to be your lawful, wedded husband?" She looked at the pastor's shaking hands. She looked at the drunk witnesses. She looked at the cracked plaster wall. She could not look at Eli. "I do," she whispered. The sound was lost in the wind howling outside. "And do you, Eli Carver, take this woman?" "I do," Eli said. His voice was flat and deep. It filled the small, cold room. It sounded final. "Then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife. You can, well, kiss her." The pastor snapped the book shut, already looking at Eli, waiting for his payment. It was done. Mary Lou turned to her new husband. This was the part of the deal, the performance. She had to seal the bargain. Eli looked down at her. His scarred face was impossible to read. He was so tall. He put a hand on her elbow to steady her. His touch was rough, the calluses on his palm catching on the thin wool of her dress. It was not gentle, but it was not unkind. She looked up at his eyes. She saw the exhaustion, the suspicion. She saw the man everyone feared. She leaned in, just a fraction, her eyes closing, wanting only to get it over with. He leaned down. He intended a brief, chaste press of lips, a seal on a contract. He expected her to be stiff, cold as ice. But the moment his lips touched hers, something inside Mary Lou broke. A small, trapped sound, half sob, half gasp, escaped her throat. She had been so alone, for so long. She had been shoved and sneered at and ignored. His touch, this simple, procedural contact, was the first human touch in a year that was not violent. Her lips, chapped and cold, suddenly softened under his. It was not a performance. It was a plea, a desperate, trembling surrender. Eli felt it, the change, the sudden, shattering vulnerability. He felt the faint, frantic beat of her pulse through her jaw. He breathed in her scent, soap and cold air and fear. He had meant to pull back immediately, but he lingered. Just a second, maybe two. He felt the warmth of her breath, the unconscious press of her body seeking anchor in the storm. It was the strangest, most dangerous feeling he had ever known. He pulled back. Mary Lou's eyes were still closed. A single tear had slipped from under her lash, freezing instantly on her cheek. Eli looked at the woman who was now his wife. He dropped his hand from her elbow as if it were burned. "It's done," he said to the pastor. He signed the register. Mary Lou took the pen, her hand shaking so badly that her new name, Mary Lou Carver, was an almost illegible scrawl. Eli dropped $2 silver into the pastor's waiting hand. The witnesses in the back pew, having finished the bottle, were already asleep. Eli grabbed her bag. "Let's go!" Outside, the world had disappeared. The sky was a low, bruised, churning gray. The snow was no longer falling in flakes. It was a horizontal, blinding sheet. The wind screamed. Eli had 2 horses tied to the hitching post, their backs already white. They were thin, hardy animals, their heads bowed against the blizzard. "The claim is 30 miles north," he shouted over the wind. "The cabin's old, but it's stocked. We need to move, now, before this storm buries the trail." He threw her bag over the rump of his horse and tied it down. He turned to her and, with the same impersonal efficiency, put his hands on her waist and lifted her onto the saddle of the other horse. She gathered the reins, her gloves doing nothing to stop the numbness in her fingers. She was Mrs. Eli Carver. She was the wife of a man they called a murderer. Eli swung into his own saddle. He did not look back at the town. He just pointed his horse north, into the teeth of the storm. Mary Lou kicked her horse, urging it to follow. They rode out of Split Rock. No one watched them go. The wind howled, erasing their tracks within minutes, swallowing the town and the world, leaving only the two of them and the endless, howling white. The ride was a special kind of hell. 30 miles in a Wyoming blizzard was not a journey. It was a sentence. Mary Lou bowed her head, letting the horse follow the dark shape of Eli's back. She could not feel her feet. She could not feel her face. The world was gone, replaced by a screaming white void. The only reality was the man in front of her, a man who moved through the storm as if he were part of it. After what felt like a lifetime, Eli stopped. His horse stood, sides heaving, plastered in ice. He dismounted and came back for her. She tried to swing her leg over, but her limbs would not obey. Her dress was frozen stiff, like a board. Eli said nothing. He simply put his hands on her waist and hauled her from the saddle. She fell against him, her legs collapsing. He held her weight for a second. A solid, unmoving wall against the wind. Then he half carried, half dragged her toward a low shape in the snow. It was a cabin, or the ghost of one. A small, sod-roofed box of rough-hewn logs, banked with snow to the windowsills. A thin curl of smoke rose from a mud and stick chimney, a sign her uncle had paid a neighbor to keep it stocked. As he'd written, beside it stood a barn, leaning so far to the east it looked like the next gust would take it. Eli kicked the door open. It scraped on the rough floorboards. Inside was one room, dark and only marginally warmer than the outside. A small stove in the corner gave off a pathetic heat. There was a narrow cot, a rough table, 2 chairs, and shelves holding tins of food and sacks of flour. He guided her to a chair and pushed her down into it. "Don't sleep," he ordered. He went back out, his steps heavy. He returned moments later, his arms piled with wood from a covered stack. He opened the stove, his movements economical and sure. He fed split pine into the fire, coaxing it, nursing it. The small box began to roar, and a wave of life-giving heat began to spread. Mary Lou watched him through a fog of cold. He moved without wasted motion. He pulled the frozen saddlebags from his shoulder and dropped them on the floor. He took her carpet bag and set it by the bed. He looked at the cot. It was the only bed. Then he looked at her. "The barn," he said. His voice was a rasp. "There's a loft. I'll take it." "But the storm," she managed, her teeth chattering. "I've slept in worse." He unrolled his bedroll on the floor, took out a heavy buffalo hide, and threw it over his shoulder. He picked up his rifle. "There's an axe by the door," he said, gesturing with his chin. "Use it. Your hands are full. Your life is your own." He walked out, shutting the door behind him. The latch clicked, and the sound was profoundly final. She was alone again, but not. She was a wife, with a husband in the barn. They found their rhythm in the days that followed. It was a rhythm of silence and hard work, measured by the rising and setting of a sun they rarely saw. The storm had passed, but the cold remained, a permanent, watchful thing. Eli kept his word. He lived in the barn loft. He rose before dawn, his footsteps crunching in the snow. He would clear a path, chop wood, and stack it high by her door. He would tend the horses, check the perimeter. He was a presence defined by his labor. Mary Lou took the cabin. She cooked, forcing her uncle's stores of dried beans and salt pork into something edible. She mended the curtains. She swept the floor. She learned to load the shotgun her uncle had left mounted over the fireplace, and she chopped wood. Eli cut the large rounds, and she split them. Her hands, once soft, blistered, then bled, then hardened into calloused claws. They spoke only when necessary. "Wood's low," she would say, her voice loud in the vast quiet. "I'll cut more," he would reply, not looking up from mending a harness. They ate separately. She would leave a plate of hot food on the table. Hours later, When she was busy outside, he would slip in, eat standing up, and be gone before she returned. They were two ghosts sharing a haunting, their lives brushing past each other but never touching. The boundaries were absolute, drawn by his coldness and her shame. Then the sky turned a dark, bruised purple, and the real storm came. It did not arrive gradually. It fell on them like a collapsing mountain. The wind shrieked, a high, maddening sound that never stopped, day or night. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, erasing the barn, the trees, the entire world in a blinding white roar. For the first day, Eli stayed in the barn. Mary Lou, trapped in the cabin, watched the path he had dug disappear in under an hour. The cabin itself groaned. Wind found every chink in the logs, driving fine, sugary snow into the room. She kept the stove blazing, but the cold on the far side of the room was as biting as the air outside. On the second morning, the door was torn open. Eli stumbled in, covered in ice, his face a raw, wind-burned red. He was carrying his bedroll and his rifle. He slammed the door against the storm and dropped the heavy bar into place. "The barn roof is tearing loose," he shouted over the din. "I can't keep a fire lit." She just nodded, her heart hammering. The one-room cabin, which had felt empty, was suddenly, suffocatingly small. He did not look at her. He unrolled his bedroll on the floor, as far from her cot as possible, his back to the stove, his head near the door. He was a watchdog, guarding the entrance. The storm raged for 4 more days. They were trapped. The silence, once a buffer, became a heavy, charged thing. They moved around each other in the cramped space, a tense, careful dance of not touching. She cooked, he ate, sitting on the floor, his plate on his knee. He would go out only to fetch more wood, a brief, violent struggle against the wind, returning each time caked in new ice. On the third night of his presence, the temperature plummeted. The wind died to a low moan, but the cold became a physical weight. The fire in the stove, burning as hot as Eli could make it, was not enough. The cabin walls were rimed with frost. Mary Lou, huddled on her cot under every blanket she owned, was shaking so hard her bones ached. Eli was sitting on his bedroll, his buffalo hide wrapped around him. He was staring at the stove, his face grim. He watched her shiver. He stood up, went to his saddlebag, and pulled out a tin flask. "Whiskey," he said. He poured a generous amount into a tin cup and handed it to her. She took it. Her hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. He put his own hand over hers, guiding the cup to her lips. The whiskey was liquid fire. It burned a trail down her throat and exploded in her stomach. She coughed, but the shaking began to subside. He drank from the flask himself, a long, deep swallow. He sat back down. The silence stretched. "You'll freeze on that cot," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The heat rises. Floor's the coldest place. You're shivering to death." She didn't know what to say. He sighed, a sound of pure exasperation. "We share the blankets. By the stove, it's survival. Nothing more." He did not wait for her answer. He grabbed his bedroll and the buffalo hide and spread them on the floorboards. As close to the stove as he could get without catching fire, he laid down, his back to her. Mary Lou hesitated. He was right. The cold was seeping into her marrow. It was not a matter of propriety. It was a matter of living until morning. She pulled her own blankets from the cot and lay down on the other side of the makeshift bed, her back to him. The space between them was a foot of cold air. It was not enough. After an hour, she was shivering again. He could feel the vibrations through the floor. He swore, low and bitter. "Come here, woman. Stop being foolish." He turned over. She turned, her eyes wide in the dim, red glow from the stove's vent. "It's just warmth," he said, his voice rough. "The deal stands." He lifted the edge of the heavy buffalo hide. It was an order, not an invitation. She crept under it, pulling her own blankets with her. They lay facing each other, 2 feet apart. The heat from his body was a palpable thing. She could feel it on her face. "Turn around," he growled. She turned, presenting her back to him. He moved closer, until his front was pressed against her back. He draped the heavy hide over both of them, sealing them in. It was a shocking, profound intimacy. She could feel the solid wall of his chest, the heat of his thighs behind her own. His breathing was a slow, deep rumble that vibrated through her spine. She was rigid, every muscle tensed. "Go to sleep," he muttered, his voice close to her ear. "I ain't gonna bite." But neither of them slept. They lay like that for hours, listening to the wind and the crackle of the fire. His warmth soaked into her, chasing the deadly chill. Her body, against her will, began to relax. Her breathing, which had been shallow and fast, deepened, falling into the same slow rhythm as his. She felt his knee brush the back of hers. It was an accidental, unconscious shift, but it sent a jolt through her, sharp as lightning. He tensed, but did not pull away. "You said you were saved by a priest," she whispered into the darkness. The words were out before she could stop them. She needed to break the spell of the physical. She needed a voice. He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. "In Texas," he said finally, his voice a low vibration against her back. After I finished it." She waited. "My brother, Ben," he said. "He was 19, soft, liked books. He bought a horse from a man named Silas, paid him cash, 2 days later. Silas and his friends, they drunk the money. They formed a posse. Said Ben stole the horse. They took him from the boarding house while I was gone. They just strung him up." Mary Lou squeezed her eyes shut. She could feel the story in him. The words were dead, but the memory was alive, a coiled, hot thing. "I found him," Eli continued, "hanging from an oak tree. Took me 2 days. I cut him down, buried him. Then I went hunting." "You found them?" It was not a question. "All 3. Took me 6 months. The last one. Silas, I didn't use a gun. They caught me after the town. They loved Silas. They didn't care what he'd done. They only cared what I'd done. They held a trial in the street. Took him 5 minutes." He shifted, and she felt the muscles in his back bunch up. "They put the rope around my neck. Same tree. I was standing on the wagon. I looked at their faces. They were all smiling. And then this old man, a priest, Father Miguel, he walked through the crowd carrying a Bible. He walked right up and stood between me and the sheriff. He said, 'This man's brother was murdered. This man's soul is mine to save. If you hang him, you hang me, too.' He was just an old man. But they hesitated. The sheriff tried to push him. The priest just stood there. He didn't budge. The rope broke when the wagon pulled away. They called it an act of God. Took it as a sign. They let me go. But they left the mark." He unconsciously touched his neck. Mary Lou felt the movement. "The priest was right about one thing," Eli whispered, his voice gone cold. "He said, 'There is God's justice and man's justice.' He was wrong. There ain't no justice at all. Just what you can take. Just what you can hold." Mary Lou lay in the dark, her heart aching, not for her own predicament, but for the man behind her. His story was a weight, heavier and colder than the storm. She understood his silence. She understood the wall. She flinched, not from him, but from the sheer, brutal cruelty of the world he had described. It was the same world that had cast her out, that had let her baby die in a cold room. The next day, the storm still howled. They moved about the cabin, the tension of the night's confession hanging between them. He did not look at her. He seemed to regret the words, to have already rebuilt the wall she had slipped behind. That afternoon, while he was outside checking the horses in the barn, She found herself standing by the stove. His confession demanded one of her own. The scales were unbalanced. He had given her his truth. She owed him the rest of hers. When he came back in, shaking snow from his coat, she spoke to the floor. "You were right," she said. He stopped, his hand on the way to the coffee pot. "About what?" "In town, you said I was holding back. I was—" He turned, his gray eyes wary. He leaned against the wall and waited. "I didn't just bring shame on my family," she said, her voice small, but clear. "I told you I was seduced. That was a lie. I wasn't a child. I knew what I was doing. I was in love with him. Or I thought I wanted someone to see me. Just me, not my father's daughter." She took a breath. "When I told him I was with child," he laughed. He said I had misunderstood, that I was a comfort. He was the preacher's son, my father's friend. My father, he didn't even yell. He just looked at me, like I was something he'd found on his boot. He gave me $20 and a train ticket west. He told me if I ever wrote, if I ever came back, he would have me arrested for theft. He said my mother was dead to me. Eli's face did not change. He just watched. "The baby," she whispered, her hand rising to her flat stomach. It was a girl. She was born in a rooming house in St. Louis. She was perfect, but I was so sick. I had no money. I couldn't feed her. She got a fever. She died in my arms. She was 3 weeks old." Mary Lou was crying now, silent tears that ran down her face and dripped onto her dress. She did not wipe them away. "I ran after that. I just ran, changed my name, worked as a seamstress, a washerwoman. I stole this black dress from a woman who didn't need it. I'm not a widow. Eli, I'm just a fake. I've been running ever since. Your brother, at least he was avenged. My little girl. She just vanished." She finally looked up at him. His scarred face was a mask, but his eyes had lost their coldness. They were just gray, deep and quiet, and full of a terrible understanding. He didn't say anything. He just pushed off the wall, walked to the stove, poured 2 cups of coffee, and handed one to her. Their confessions hung in the air, a fragile, dangerous bridge between them. That night, the wind returned, stronger than before, a howling banshee wail that seemed intent on tearing the cabin apart. They laid out their bedrolls again. This time, there was no hesitation. They lay back to back, sharing the warmth, a silent acknowledgement. But Mary Lou could not sleep. The wind, his story, her own dredged-up grief. It was all too much. She turned over, carefully, so as not to touch him. He was awake. His eyes were open, glinting in the red stove light. He was watching her. "I can't sleep," she whispered. "Nor I," he rumbled. The wind hit the cabin with a force that shook the floor. Mary Lou flinched, letting out a small cry. He rolled onto his side to face her. "It'll hold," he said. "How do you know?" "Jed Stone built it," he said. "He was an old coot, but he built it to last. He knew the wind." They were quiet, just looking at each other. The space between them was only inches. She could see the scar on his cheek, the way it pulled at his skin. She had the sudden, mad urge to touch it. "You're not a fake," he said, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. "You're a survivor." No one had ever said anything like that to her. No one had ever looked at her and seen strength. She did not know who moved first. Perhaps they both did. It was a slow, tentative drift, a closing of the last few inches. His hand came up, his rough, calloused fingers brushing the hair back from her face. His touch was hesitant, as if he were touching a flame, and then his lips were on hers. It was not like the kiss at the altar. That had been cold, desperate. This was slow. It was tentative. It was a question. It tasted of whiskey and coffee and shared sorrow. She answered, Her lips softened. She let out the breath she'd been holding, a soft sigh that he drank in. Her hand came up, not to his scar, but to his shoulder, her fingers gripping the rough wool of his shirt. The kiss changed. The tentativeness burned away, replaced by a sudden, starving heat. His other arm came around her, pulling her against him. His mouth turned passionate, demanding, and she met him with a force that surprised them both. It was a storm inside their storm, a desperate, drowning kiss of two people who had been alone for too long. It was grief and rage and a terrible, aching need. He was on top of her, his weight pressing her into the furs, his mouth devouring hers. She was clinging to him, her fingers tangled in his hair, her body arching up to meet his. Then, just as suddenly, he stopped. He tore his mouth from hers and shoved himself backward, scrambling away from her as if she were on fire. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. "No," he growled, his back to her. He got to his feet and stood by the stove, his hands clenched into fists. Mary Lou lay on the furs, her lips bruised, her body trembling with a different kind of cold. Confusion and a hot, sharp shame washed over her. "This," he said, his voice a guttural rasp, "was not part of the deal." He grabbed his coat from the peg. "Eli, wait!" she cried, sitting up. "The storm!" "Damn the storm!" He unbarred the door and wrenched it open. The wind and snow exploded into the room. He stepped out into it and slammed the door behind him. Mary Lou sat alone in the howling dark, the warmth of his body already fading. She was hurt, she was confused, but as the minutes ticked by, the hurt curdled into a slow, cold anger. He had kissed her, he had started it, and he had finished it. He had treated her like the preacher's son. She dressed, pulling on her boots. She wrapped herself in a blanket and sat in the chair, staring at the door. She did not sleep. He returned at dawn. He was half frozen, his coat a solid sheet of ice. He looked broken. He stumbled to the stove, his hands shaking violently as he held them out to the warmth. She waited. When he finally turned to look at her, his face was a mask of self-loathing. "Mary Lou," he started. "Don't," she said, her voice flat. "I don't need your apologies, and I don't need a protector. I've been protecting myself for a long time. I just need someone who won't lie. You said the deal stands, then let it stand. But don't you kiss me and then run? Eli, don't you treat me like I'm unclean." He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the iron in her spine. He saw the woman who had crossed a continent alone. He saw the woman who had faced him down in a saloon. He gave a single slow nod. "It won't happen again," he said. The storm broke 2 days later. The world was reborn, white and silent and dazzlingly bright. The new silence in the cabin was worse than the old. It was wounded. Eli moved back to the barn loft without a word. They returned to their chores. The divide was wider than ever. Days passed. The cold lessened its grip. One afternoon, Mary Lou went to check the small, snow-covered chicken coop her uncle had built. She found a mess of feathers and blood in the snow. 3 of the 6 hens were gone. She followed the tracks. A fox, starving like everything else. She went to the barn. Eli was oiling a harness. "A fox took 3 chickens," she said. He stopped his work. "All right, I'll set a snare." "No," she said. "It'll just chew its leg off and get away, or another will come. We need to trap it. A box trap. I know how. My uncle wrote me." He looked surprised. "A box trap?" "We need wood and a trigger mechanism." He nodded. "Show me." They worked all afternoon. He cut the wood to her specifications. She, with her smaller, more nimble fingers, worked on the trigger. They argued. "The pin's too thick," she said. "It'll stick." "It's too thin. It'll snap," he countered. "It has to be sensitive. Let me..." He stepped back, watching as she whittled the pin to a near-perfect point. They assembled the box. They baited it with the remains of one of the hens. They placed it by the coop. They waited. That night, they heard the sharp snap of the trap door. They ran out together, Eli grabbing his rifle, Mary Lou holding the lantern. In the box, a large red fox snarled and threw itself against the wooden bars. "We did it," Mary Lou breathed, a thrill running through her. Eli raised his rifle. "No, wait," she said. Don't kill it. It's just hungry." He lowered the gun, looking at her as if she were mad. "It killed your chickens." "It's trapped. We can take it away, far away, down by the creek." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, a strange, rusted sound came from his throat. It was a dry chuckle. "You're a strange woman, Mary Lou Carver, all this work, and you want to let it go." "It's alive," she said simply. "It deserves a chance, just somewhere else." "All right," he said, the smile touching his eyes. "We'll relocate the beast." They worked together, sliding a board under the trap, and carried it, heavy and snarling, 1/2 mile down to the creek bed. They released it. The fox bolted into the darkness. They walked back, their boots crunching in the snow. The silence between them was, for the first time, comfortable. "We make a good team," she said quietly. He looked at her, the moonlight catching the silver of his scar. "We do." A small, genuine smile touched her face, and, for the first time, she laughed. It was a clear, bright sound in the frozen air. Eli stopped walking. He just watched her, and the hard, frozen ground around his own heart seemed to crack, just a little. It was in that moment, in that shared, simple victory, that the wind changed. It was no longer just the wind. It carried a new sound, the rhythmic, dull thud of hoofbeats. Not one horse, many. The laughter died on Mary Lou's lips. She looked at Eli. His smile was gone. His hand was on the butt of his pistol. He was looking north, toward the trail from town. "Someone's found us," he said. His voice was flat. "Get in the cabin. Bar the door." The brief, comfortable silence that had settled between them shattered. Eli's hand, which had been relaxed at his side, was now a white-knuckled grip on his pistol. He moved, placing himself between Mary Lou and the sound, his body a solid shield. "Inside the cabin," he said, his voice a low, flat command. "Bar the door and grab the shotgun. Don't come out, no matter what you hear." "Eli, Now, Mary Lou." She ran. Her feet slipped on the icy path, but she caught herself, scrambling into the cabin and dropping the heavy wooden bar into its iron brackets. Her hands, shaking, went to the shotgun over the mantel. It was heavy, so much heavier than she remembered. She fumbled with the shells, loading two, just as he had shown her. She waited by the door, her heart a cold hammer against her ribs. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped. She heard the crunch of boots in the snow, the jingle of spurs. "Carver!" a voice boomed. It was a voice she recognized from the land office, slick with false authority. "Sheriff Clanton. Show yourself, and the woman." Mary Lou heard Eli step off the porch. "What do you want, Clanton?" "Just a friendly visit. Carver. Brought some folks to congratulate you on your marriage." There was the sound of gruff laughter from several men. Mary Lou peered through a crack in the window shutter. She could see them now. Clanton sat on a big bay horse, his star glinting. With him were 4 other men, hard-looking deputies with rifles resting on their saddles. They were not a greeting party. They were a posse. "We ain't in need of congratulations," Eli said. His voice was calm, but it carried in the cold air, sharp as an axe. Clanton swung down from his horse. He held a piece of paper. "Well, that's a shame, because the town is very interested in your union. See, an interested party filed a challenge to your wife's claim." Mary Lou's blood ran cold. Says here, Clanton continued, tapping the paper, that the claim filed by Jedediah Stone reverts to the territory if the heir fails to meet the residency and household requirements. A lone woman don't count, as we told her, and a fake marriage. Well, that's fraud. Carver, that's a federal offense. The marriage is real, Eli said. Is it? Clanton smiled, a slow, unpleasant spreading of his lips. He looked past Eli, right at the cabin door. Then you won't mind proving it. Judge Hemlock is particular about paperwork. He wants to see the license, and he wants to hear from a witness. Or... His smile widened. He'll sign the order of eviction himself, and the arrest warrant for fraud. For both of you. Eli did not move. We were married by Pastor Gideon. In the church, it's legal. Mary Lou unbarred the door and stepped out, the shotgun held, trembling, at her side. It's true. Sheriff, it was all proper. Clanton's gaze lingered on her, insolent and appraising. Mrs. Carver, you look, well, country air suits you. He turned his eyes back to Eli. Pastor Gideon, you say? Funny, last I heard, the pastor was fond of the bottle. Men'll sign anything for a drink, won't they? And paper, well, paper burns. The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp as an icicle. You've got 3 days, Clanton said, swinging back onto his horse. 3 days to ride into town and present Judge Hemlock with your proof, your license, your witness. If you can't, the land is forfeit, and I'll be back to collect you myself. Carver, I've been looking for a good reason to put you in chains. He tipped his hat to Mary Lou. Ma'am. The posse turned their horses. They rode away, their laughter mixing with the sound of their departure, leaving a vast, poisoned silence in their wake. Mary Lou stared at the space where they had been, the shotgun suddenly feeling as if it weighed 100 pounds. She let it drop to her side. 3 days, she whispered. Eli's face was grim. He kicked a chunk of icy snow off the porch step. He's not blowing smoke. He thinks he has us. He does have us, she said, following him into the cabin. He barred the door, but it felt useless, like locking a cage. Eli, he knows. Paper burns. He knows. She began to pace the small room, her hands clenched, her mind racing. The fox trap, their brief moment of shared laughter. It felt like a cruel joke. We'll ride in tomorrow, Eli said, checking his rifle, his movements stiff. We'll get the license from Gideon. We'll find one of those drunk witnesses. No, her voice was sharp, bordering on hysteria. You don't understand. He stopped, looking at her. Understand what? The license, she said, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. The pastor, he was so drunk. Eli, his hands were shaking, and the witnesses, you pulled them from the saloon. They were half unconscious. What if Gideon never filed it? What if he signed the wrong line? What if one of those men scribbled nonsense? It might not be legal. It might just be a piece of paper in his desk drawer. Or Clanton might have it already. The confession hung in the air. The foundation of their entire world, the one document that kept them safe, was likely worthless. Eli stared at her, the reality settling in his gray eyes. He saw it now. The completeness of the trap. Mary Lou's strength, the iron rod that had held her up since Ohio, finally snapped. She sank onto the cot, her face in her hands. He's going to arrest you, she sobbed, the words muffled. This was never about the land. It was about you. He wants you for those men in Texas. This fraud is just his excuse. He's going to take you, and they're going to hang you. All because of me. She looked up, her face ravaged by fear. You have to go. I'm not running. Mary Lou. Yes, you are, she cried, scrambling to her feet. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in. Go, now. Take your horse. Take the best one. Ride east. I'll I'll tell them you left me. I'll tell them you coerced me. It doesn't matter. Just go. He won't hang a woman, but he will hang you." She was pushing him toward the door, her panic making her strong. "He wants you. Eli, don't you understand? I brought this on you. I won't be the reason you—" She couldn't say the word. He stood like a stone, letting her push against him. He watched her, his scarred face unreadable in the dim light. He saw her terror. Not for herself, but for him. She was trying to save him, just as she had insisted on saving the fox. She was all instinct, all heart, and it was going to get them both killed. He grabbed her wrists. "Stop," he said. "No, you have to listen to me. Go!" "Mary Lou, stop." His voice was a low growl, cutting through her panic. He held her wrists, stilling her. She looked up at him, her chest heaving with sobs, tears streaming down her face. "We're not running," he said, his voice softer, but no less firm. "Not you, not me. We're done running." "But it's a lie," she whispered, broken. "The marriage, the license, it's all a lie." He pulled her closer, his hands moving from her wrists to her shoulders, his grip firm, anchoring her. "Then we make it real," he said, his voice a rough rasp. "If they want a show, we'll give 'em one. If they want a married couple, they'll find one." She stared at him, confused, her tears still wet on her cheeks. "What?" He didn't answer with words. He bent his head and kissed her. It was not the cold, desperate kiss at the altar. It was not the hesitant, questioning kiss during the storm. This was a claiming. It was rough and deep and full of a furious, defiant energy. It was a kiss that tasted of fear and anger and a sudden, undeniable hunger. It was the kiss of a man who had been pushed too far, a man who had nothing left to lose and had, in that instant, found the one thing he would not let go of. He backed her against the wall, his mouth devouring hers. His body pinned her, hard and warm. She let out a small, broken sound, and it was not a sound of protest. Her hands, which had been pushing him away, flew up, her fingers tangling in his thick hair, pulling him closer. She kissed him back with all the terror and grief and desperate, buried longing inside her. This was not a bargain. This was not a pretense. This was the only real thing in a world of lies. He pulled her away from the wall, his mouth never leaving hers, and they stumbled, half falling, onto the furs spread before the stove. They sank to the floor in a storm of passion and fear, a tangle of limbs and wool and shared desperation. He was shedding his coat. His hands were in her hair, on her waist, pulling at the buttons of her dress. She was clinging to him, her nails scraping his back, anchoring herself to him as the world spun out of control. It was raw and graceless and utterly necessary. It was the only answer they had. Later, the cabin was quiet. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind. They lay tangled in the blankets on the floor, the adrenaline and passion slowly ebbing, leaving a different, more profound quiet in its wake. Mary Lou lay with her head on his chest. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart beneath her ear. She could feel the raised, ropey scar on his shoulder. A mark she had not known was there. The fear of Clanton was still present. A cold stone in her stomach, but it was joined by a new, terrifying warmth. She began to cry, but silently this time, the tears just leaking from her eyes and falling onto his skin. He tensed. "What is it?" "I'm afraid," she whispered, her voice muffled against him. "But it's not just Clanton, not anymore." He waited, his hand still on her back. "I think," she said, the words costing her everything. "I think I'm falling for you, Eli." She felt him go still. The steady rise and fall of his chest paused. He did not speak for a long time. Then, slowly, He moved, pulling back just enough to sit up. He turned away from her, staring into the red glow of the stove, his back a rigid wall. She pulled the blanket up to cover herself, a sudden, cold shame washing over her. She had misread everything. It had just been an act of desperation, and she had turned it into something more. "Falling is dangerous, Mary Lou," he said, his voice flat and hard. He looked at the fire, not at her. His face was stone. "It's how you get hurt. It's how you end up with a rope around your neck." It was not the rejection she had feared. It was a warning, a confession. He was not telling her that she was dangerous. He was telling her that the feeling was... He stood up. All business, pulling on his boots. The brief, raw intimacy was gone. Locked away. "We got 2 days. We ride for town at first light. We find Gideon, or we find one of those witnesses. We find something." The ride to Split Rock was a study in tension. They rode side by side, their knees almost brushing. The charged energy from the cabin floor was still between them, unresolved, simmering under a surface of grim determination. The town, when they reached it, looked just as it had, cold, windswept, and indifferent. They went to the church first. It was gone. It was not just empty. It was a pile of blackened, wet timbers and soot-stained stone. The snow around the foundation was melted and gray. The small iron bell lay on its side near the street, cracked and silent. Mary Lou put a hand to her mouth. A gasp of horror lodged in her throat. Eli dismounted and walked through the ruins. He kicked at a charred beam. "Kerosene," he said, his voice void of emotion. It was deliberate. Done a few days ago, by the look of it. "Gideon," she whispered. "Did he?" "He lived in a room in the back," Eli said grimly. They went to the saloon. It was early, and the place was mostly empty. The same bartender from her first day was wiping the bar. He looked up, saw Eli, and his hand froze. "Carver," he said, his voice wary. "We're looking for Pastor Gideon," Eli said, his voice flat. The bartender relaxed. "Just a fraction." "He's gone. Lit out 2, maybe 3 nights ago. Just vanished. Took his bags. Good riddance, if you ask me. Never seen a man drink so much." "He didn't say where he was going?" Mary Lou asked. "No, ma'am, just gone, like the church." "What about the 2 men who were always in here?" Eli pressed. "Amos Fry and Pete Stokes, the ones who'd sign their name for a drink." The bartender shrugged. "Funny you ask. Amos, he got a job with the railroad. Up north. Left yesterday on the eastbound train. Sudden-like. And Pete." He shook his head. "Ain't seen Pete in a week. Man probably fell in a snowdrift. Won't find him till spring." A clean sweep. The church, the pastor, the witnesses. Every trace of their wedding had been systematically erased. The ride back to the cabin was silent. The sky was a low, heavy gray. The noose was tightening, and they both knew it. They spent the next day, their last day, in a tense, furious preparation. Eli brought the horses into the small, sturdy barn. He stacked firewood inside the cabin. He cleaned his rifle and his pistol until they gleamed. Mary Lou baked bread, her movements jerky, her mind 1,000 miles away. She stacked tins of food. She checked the water barrels. They were fortifying a prison. In the afternoon, Eli took the shotgun from the wall. "Come outside," he said. He set up 3 empty bean tins on a fence post, 50 feet away. The air was bitingly cold. Still. "Clanton ain't coming alone," he said. "And he's not coming just to talk. I can't be in 2 places at once. You need to know how to use this." He handed her the shotgun. It was heavy, and her arms trembled. I don't think I can," she said. "You can." He stepped behind her. "Plant your feet, square, like this." He used his boot to nudge her feet apart. She tried to lift the gun, but it wavered. It's too heavy." "You're stronger than you look," he said. He moved closer, until his chest was pressed against her back. The sudden, solid warmth of him made her breath catch. "Lean into it," he said, his voice a low rumble, his chin brushing the top of her hair. "If you fight it, the kick will break your shoulder. You gotta become part of it." His arms came around her, his larger, calloused hands covering hers. One hand on the forestock, one on the grip. He smelled of pine smoke and gunpowder. "Sight down the barrel," he whispered, his breath warm on her ear. "Put the bead on the tin. Now. Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it. Slow." His fingers settled over hers. She was trapped between the cold, heavy metal of the gun and the hot, solid wall of his body. Her heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could feel it against her back. The intimacy of the moment was so profound, so jarring. It was hard to breathe. He squeezed her finger. The boom of the shotgun was deafening. It slammed back into her shoulder, but his body took the brunt of the recoil, his arms tightening around her, holding her steady. She had missed all 3 tins. "Again," he said, his voice was rough. They reloaded. He did not move. He stayed pressed against her, his hands on hers. "Breathe," he commanded. "Squeeze." They fired again and again. The desire that had been simmering between them since they'd left the cabin floor was back, thick and undeniable. It was not passion. It was tension. It was the unresolved energy, the fear, and the proximity. This was not a shooting lesson. It was a new kind of torture. On the 4th shot, she hit the middle tin. It flew off the post, spinning into the snow. A small, choked sound of triumph escaped her. He stepped back. The contact was broken. The cold air rushed into the space between them. Mary Lou turned, her face flushed, her eyes bright. "I did it," she breathed. His gray eyes were dark, his face a mask. "Good," he said, his voice strained. "Keep practicing. I'll watch the ridge." He turned and walked away, grabbing his rifle and heading for the high ground behind the barn, leaving her alone with the smell of gunpowder and the lingering, phantom warmth of his body. That night, their last night, was a torment. Mary Lou could not stay inside. The cabin felt like a tomb. She pulled a blanket around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. The sky was clear. The wind had died. The stars were so bright they seemed close enough to touch. A billion pinpricks of ice in the black velvet sky. She heard the crunch of snow, and her hand flew to her throat. It was just Eli. He was leaning against the porch post, his rifle cradled in his arms, watching her. "You should sleep," he said. "I can't." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I was just looking. It's so big. It makes our troubles feel small." "They ain't small," he said, his gaze fixed on the dark trail from town. "And they're coming at dawn." They stood in silence for a long time. She turned, looking at his hard profile in the starlight. "Eli," she said quietly. Back in Texas, before the rope, what were you fighting for?" He was quiet for a long moment. "My brother, Ben, I was fighting for him. After, I wasn't fighting for anything, just breathing." She looked back up at the vast, uncaring sky. "What does it feel like?" she whispered. "Freedom. Real freedom. I've been running for so long, I don't think I'd even know what it looks like." He watched her. He watched the way the starlight caught the pale line of her jaw, the way her breath plumed in the cold. He thought of his life, the cold shack, the fear, the running, the scar that pulled at his neck every time he swallowed. He thought of her, crying in his arms. He thought of the taste of her, the feel of her. "I didn't know it either," he said, his voice a low rasp. She turned to look at him, surprised by the sudden vulnerability in his tone. He nodded, a single, sharp movement. "That night, by the fire." He looked at her, his gray eyes catching the starlight. And for the first time she saw no walls, no stone, only the man. "Your kiss," he said. It was the first thing that felt like it. He pushed off the post, his face hardening again as he pulled the mask back into place. "Get inside. Mary Lou, get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He turned and walked toward the barn to take the first watch, his boots crunching in the snow, leaving her alone on the porch, holding his words like the only weapon she had left. He was not asleep. He was sitting on the porch, his rifle across his knees, when the sky was still a bruised, starless purple. Dawn was an hour away, but Eli was not watching the east. He was watching the trail from town. He heard them before he saw them, the same sound that had frozen Mary Lou's laughter, the dull thud of hoofbeats on frozen earth. They were not waiting for dawn. They were coming early, in the dark, to catch them sleeping. He moved, a shadow detaching from the deeper shadows of the cabin. "Mary Lou," he called, his voice a low command. "They're here. Stay inside. Bar the door." He heard the bar drop. He stepped off the porch, chambering around, the metallic shuck-shuck sound unnaturally loud in the frozen air. He moved behind the meager protection of the wellhead, his body low, his rifle leveled at the ridge. They came into view, 4 riders against the slowly graying sky. He recognized Clanton's broad shape instantly, but they were not fanned out as if for an attack. They were riding steady. And there was a 5th man. This man was different. He was heavy in the saddle, wearing a fine wool coat that looked out of place, and a bowler hat. They stopped 30 yards from the cabin. "Carver," Clanton called out. His voice was smug. "You're up early. We're here to escort you to court. Turns out, we can move the docket up. Judge Hemlock is an early riser." "The 3rd day ain't till tomorrow," Eli said, his voice flat. "Plans change." Clanton said, "We got a new witness, a new claimant. Seems your wife here ain't the only heir to Jedediah Stone." The 5th man urged his horse forward. He was fleshy, with a pale, soft face and small, deep-set eyes that darted around, taking in the cabin, the barn, the man with the rifle. He looked at the property with open disdain. Mary Lou, watching from the crack in the shutter, let out a sound. It was not a scream. It was a choked, strangled gasp of pure disbelief. The man heard it. He smiled, a wet, unpleasant expression. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the snow. "Clara May," he said. His voice was oily. "Is that any way to greet your cousin, after all this time?" Mary Lou wrenched the door open, the bar scraping. She stood in the doorway, the shotgun in her hands, but her arms were limp. She was staring at the man as if he were a ghost. "Martin," she whispered. The name was like ash in her mouth. "So it is you," Martin said, his smile widening. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her worn dress, her calloused hands, her wind-chapped face. "My goodness, you've fallen far, though, given your nature, I'm not surprised." He sniffed the air. "You smell of pine smoke and filth." "What are you doing here?" Her voice was shaking, not with fear, but with a deep, cold rage. "I'm here for what's mine. Cousin," Martin said. He pulled a sheaf of folded papers from his coat pocket and held them out to Clanton. "When my aunt disowned you, she wrote to our Uncle Jedediah, told him you were unclean, that you had shamed the family, that you were never to be given so much as $1. He paused for effect, suggested he amend his will. Clanton took the papers. "This here," he said, tapping it, "is a last will and testament, filed proper back in Ohio, dated 6 months ago. It names Mr. Martin Hayes here as the sole heir to Jedediah Stone's property and holdings, which means that will you filed," he looked at Mary Lou, "is a forgery, or, at the very least, null and void." "That's a lie," Mary Lou said, finding her voice. Uncle Jedediah wrote to me. He pitied you, Martin snapped. He always had a soft spot for strays. But blood is blood. Clara May, and you tainted ours. You have no right to this land. You have no right to anything. She has my name, Eli said. The words, his first, cut through the morning air. All eyes turned to him. He was still behind the well, his rifle rock steady. The muzzle pointed not at Clanton, but at Martin. Martin laughed. Your name? You married this fallen woman, this whore. Eli's thumb moved. The hammer of the rifle clicked back. The sound was definitive. It stopped Martin's laughter. It made Clanton's deputies shift in their saddles, their hands moving to their own weapons. That's my wife you're talking to, Eli said, his voice quiet. And this is our land. You're trespassing. Now, Carver, Clanton said, his hand raised. Don't be rash. We got the law on our side. You raise that rifle and you're dead. Maybe, Eli said, but he'll be dead first. Martin's face had gone pale. He took a half step back, positioning himself behind Clanton's horse. A standoff. The sun was just beginning to touch the highest peaks, bathing the scene in a cold, pink light. The world held its breath. Clanton was the one to break it. He sighed, a sound of theatrical frustration. He was a man who enjoyed his games, and this one was not going to end in a clean shooting. Not yet. All right. Carver, Clanton said. You want to play it by the book? Fine. I was trying to save you the trip. We'll do this proper one night. He looked at Martin. It seems we must wait. Then he looked at Eli. Be in Judge Hemlock's courtroom tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. You bring your proof, Mr. Hayes here will bring his... He gathered his reins. And I'm telling you this as a courtesy. Carver, when the judge rules in Mr. Hayes's favor, and he will, I will be arresting you for conspiracy to commit fraud. And I'll be arresting her. He nodded at Mary Lou. For trespassing. You'll be separated. You'll go to the federal prison. She'll go to the territorial jail. And this land, he smiled, will finally have a respectable owner. Martin spat a thick glob of phlegm onto the snow near the porch. I'll be back tomorrow, cousin, to burn this shack down and build something decent. They turned their horses and rode away. They did not look back. Mary Lou stood in the doorway until they were gone. The shotgun slipped from her numb fingers, thudding onto the porch. She backed into the cabin and sank to the floor, her back against the wall. Eli barred the door. He did not speak. He went to the small shelf where he kept his ammunition. He began, methodically, to check his shells, laying them out in neat rows on the table. She watched him. His hands were steady. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He was not packing to leave. He was not planning a defense. He was preparing for a war. He's right, she whispered. Eli's hand stilled. What? Martin. He's right. My father. He would have done that. He would have written to Uncle Jed. He would have erased me. That will... It's probably real. Mine is probably the one that's worthless. She pulled her knees to her chest. It's over, Eli. They've won. No, he said. He slid a shell into the rifle's chamber. It ain't over. What are you doing? She asked, though she already knew. You're not going to court, are you? He looked at her, his gray eyes flat and cold. There's no court. There's just Clanton and his men. He ain't gonna let us leave this valley. He'll come back, and he'll say we resisted. So you're just going to wait for them? You're going to fight them? All of them. She scrambled to her feet. That's not a fight. Eli, that's a suicide. They'll kill you before you even raise your rifle. He said nothing. He just went back to his shells. She went to him. She put her hand on his arm, on the hard, bunched muscle. He was vibrating with a tension she had not felt before, not even during the storm. Eli, look at me. He slowly raised his head. "This is my fault," she said, her voice raw. "My past, my family, my uncle. I dragged you into this. I tied you to me with a lie. Please, don't die for me!" Her plea hung in the small, cold room. The desperation in her voice, the genuine terror for him, seemed to break through the cold armor he had built around himself. He looked down at her hand on his arm. He covered it with his own, his calloused, scarred fingers lacing through hers. "I already did, once," he whispered. His words, so strange and final, confused her. "What?" He looked past her, at the frosty window, at a memory she could not see. "The day they put that rope around my neck, the man I was, he died. He died on that wagon. I've just been walking around since, waiting." He turned his gaze back to her, and the coldness was gone, replaced by a raw, painful honesty that mirrored her own. "This," he said, his voice rough. This ain't waiting. This is living. I won't let him take it." "Then don't let him," she cried, her tears finally breaking free. She stepped into him, her free hand coming up to grip his shirt. "Don't let him take me. Let's go. Let's ride. Now. We can go south. We can go where they'll never find us. I don't care about the land. Eli, I don't care about the cabin. I don't want to be alone again." She was clinging to him, her face buried in his chest, her shoulders shaking. He held her, his arms, so strong they could split timber, wrapped around her, pulling her tight. He was holding her as if she were the only real thing in the world. He breathed in her scent, soap and fear and the faint trace of wood smoke. He kissed her, his mouth finding her hair, her temple, her tear-streaked cheek. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of grief. "There's nowhere to run, Mary Lou," he murmured against her skin. "They'd hunt us. Clanton would see to it. We'd freeze or starve before we got 100 miles.
"Then what?"
she sobbed, looking up at him.
"What do we do? We have one night."
He looked at her, his eyes dark. He saw the terror, the fight, the loyalty. He saw the woman who had faced him down in a saloon, the woman who had cried for her lost child, the woman who had hit a tin can with a shotgun. He kissed her mouth. It was not a kiss, it was an oath. It was raw and desperate and final. It was all the words he did not have. He kissed her with all the fury he felt for Clanton, all the hate he felt for Martin, and all the desperate, terrifying love he felt for her. She met him. She clung to him, her hands moving from his chest to his neck, pulling him down. This was not a surrender. This was an anchor. This was the only thing left. They were two outcasts, two survivors, holding each other against the end of the world. He lifted her, his arms sliding under her legs, and carried her the 2 steps to the furs by the stove. He did not lay her down gently. He fell with her, a tangle of limbs and desperation. They tore at each other's clothes, their hands frantic, needing to erase the space, the cold, the fear. It was not lovemaking. It was a raw, emotional clinging. It was a final, defiant act in a world that had given them nothing but pain. It was the only truth they had left. They lay tangled in the furs, the fire burning low. The cabin was silent, but for the sound of their breathing, the clock on the mantel ticked, each sound a hammer blow, counting down the hours. Eli pulled the blanket over her shoulder. She was nestled against his side, her head on his chest. The fear had not gone. It had just settled. He was staring at the ceiling, at the rough-hewn beams. His mind was working. He was no longer planning a gunfight. He was planning an escape. Not running, a gamble. "The priest," he said. Mary Lou stirred, lifting her head. "What, Pastor Gideon?" "No," Eli said, sitting up. He pulled her with him, wrapping the blanket around them both. "The one in Texas, the one who saved me, Father Miguel." "Texas, Eli, that's..." That's 1,000 miles. He's not in Texas anymore, Eli said. He was dressing, his movements fast, decisive. I heard a year ago from a freighter, the father. He was sent north, to the Arapaho. He runs a mission chapel near the Wind River. Wind River? How far? Eli pulled on his boots. He looked at her, his face grim. 60 miles, maybe more. Through the passes. Mary Lou did the mental arithmetic. 60 miles there, 60 miles back, before 9 in the morning. It's impossible, she whispered. It's the only chance we have, he said. He grabbed his saddlebags. Clanton and Hemlock, they're thieves. But Hemlock is still a judge. He has to keep up appearances. He can't just ignore a priest, a man of God. If Father Miguel testifies to my character, if he tells the court that I was saved, not just a murderer, it might give Hemlock pause. It might be enough. It's a chance, Mary Lou said, her own resolve hardening. She was dressing just as fast, pulling on her warmest clothes. I'm coming with you. No, Eli said, turning on her. It'll be hard riding and brutal cold. I can move faster alone. You need a witness, she said, her voice firm. They're not just attacking you. They're attacking me, my cousin, my Will. I will be there. I will face him. And you need someone to vouch for you. Eli, we are husband and wife. We ride together. He looked at her, at the iron in her spine. He gave a single, sharp nod. Get the warmest coat and the whiskey. They rode out not 10 minutes later, leaving the cabin dark. They took both horses, pushing them hard into the pre-dawn cold. They did not ride toward town. They rode north, into the high, desolate country, racing the clock, racing the law, racing the snow. The journey was a frozen, waking nightmare. They pushed the horses up switchbacks, through deep snowdrifts, and across wind-scoured ridges where the cold was a living thing, a blade that cut through their wool and leather. The moon was a sliver of ice, offering no warmth, only a pale, ghostly light on the endless white. Mary Lou followed Eli, her world shrinking to the dark shape of his back, the laboring breath of her horse, and the searing pain of the cold in her lungs. They stopped only once, to let the horses breathe and to force whiskey between their own numb lips. We're halfway, Eli shouted over the wind, his voice hoarse. We have to push on. They found the mission just as the sky was turning from black to a sick, watery gray. It was not a grand church. It was a small, humble building of adobe and rough wood, nestled in a fold of the hills. A single cross silhouetted against the coming dawn. A thin curl of smoke rose from its chimney. Eli practically fell from his horse. He ran to the door and pounded on it. It opened a crack. A small, wrinkled face peered out. It was a native woman, old and wary. Father Miguel, Eli gasped, the name torn from his frozen lungs. I must see Father Miguel. The door opened wider. A man stood behind the woman. He was old, so much older than Eli remembered. His hair a white fringe around a weathered, kind face. He was holding a lamp. He lifted it. Elias, the priest whispered, his eyes widening. He looked at Eli's face, at the scar the rope had left. My son, I thought you were dead. I am, Eli said, his voice cracking. But Father, I need your help. They're trying to hang me again. They were inside, in a small, warm room. Mary Lou, her hands shaking so violently she could not hold the cup, told the story. She spoke of Clanton, the land, the faked marriage, the arrival of her cousin. Father Miguel listened, his expression growing grave. He looked from Mary Lou's desperate, frost-bitten face to Eli's. You saved me once, Eli said. You stood between me and the rope. You told them I was a man worth saving. I spoke the truth, the priest said, his voice gentle. I saw a man avenging his blood, not a killer. I need you to speak it again, Eli pleaded. In court, this morning. In Split Rock. It's our only hope." The priest looked at the small clock on his wall. It was past 6 in the morning. "Split Rock," he said. "That is a brutal ride, and we would be late." "We have to try," Mary Lou said. The priest looked at them. He saw the desperation, but he also saw the bond between them, the fierce, protective way Eli stood by her side. "Elias," he said, placing a hand on Eli's arm. "I will come. I will gather my things. I will ride with you. I will testify to your character. I will tell them what I saw." He paused, his old eyes full of sorrow. "But you must prepare yourselves. Truth alone is not always enough. You are asking for justice from men who profit from injustice. They will not easily be swayed by the words of an old priest." The ride back was a race against the sun. They had a third horse now, the priest's sturdy mule, but their own horses were exhausted, and the weather, which had held for their ride north, turned. The wind rose again, a high, keening shriek. It picked up the snow from the ground, creating a blinding, swirling whiteness. It was a ground blizzard, the most dangerous kind. They lost the trail. "We have to keep moving," Eli shouted, but his words were ripped away by the gale. Mary Lou could no longer feel her hands. The whiskey was gone. The world was a white, screaming void. She was so tired. The exhaustion was a heavy, warm blanket, pulling her down. She slumped forward in the saddle. "Mary Lou." Eli's voice was a distant crack of sound. She tried to answer, but her lips were numb. She felt herself sliding. Eli was off his horse in an instant, lunging, catching her before she hit the snow. She was a dead weight in his arms. Her eyes were closed. Her skin was a waxy, terrifying white. "She's freezing," the priest shouted, his face a mask of fear. "We must find shelter. She will not last another hour." "There," Eli pointed. It was not a cave, just a dark slash in the whiteness, a deep overhang of rock. He carried her. He did not feel her weight. He felt nothing but a cold, adrenalized terror. He lay her down in the shallow shelter. Out of the direct wind, the priest and Eli fought the horses, tying them to a stunted, frozen pine. "Fire!" Eli roared. "We need fire!" He worked with a frantic, desperate speed. His hands were numb, but he forced them to obey. He used his knife to shave bark, to find the driest tinder deep in his saddlebag. He struck his flint, again and again, his hands shaking, cursing. A spark caught. He shielded the tiny flame with his own body, blowing on it, feeding it. It caught. A small, precious fire began to blaze. The priest was rubbing Mary Lou's hands, trying to force life back into them. "It's not enough," Eli said, his voice raw. He stripped off his heavy coat. He pulled the blankets from his bedroll. He laid her on them, close to the fire. He began to unbutton her frozen coat. "What are you doing?" the priest asked. "She's frozen deep," Eli said, his voice a growl. "Rubbing won't help. She needs heat, my heat." He shed his own layers and, pulling the blankets over them both, pressed his body against hers. He wrapped his arms and legs around her, forcing his life, his warmth, into her frozen limbs. The priest turned away, adding wood to the fire, giving them privacy. Eli held her. He held her with a desperate, prayer-like intensity. He held her through the morning. He held her as the sun passed its unseen zenith. He held her as 9 o'clock came and went, as the court in Split Rock opened, and as Judge Hemlock, with a bang of his gavel, surely gave their land away. He didn't care. He just held her. She stirred in the afternoon. Her first sensation was warmth, deep, aching, penetrating warmth. Her second was the steady, slow beat of a heart under her cheek. Her eyes fluttered open. She saw the rough, smoke-stained rock of the cave roof. She smelled the fire. She felt the heavy weight of blankets and the solid, living presence of her husband wrapped around her. "Eli?" she whispered. Her throat was raw. He tensed, then pulled back just enough to look at her. His face was haggard. His beard was frosted with ice, his eyes red-rimmed from smoke and exhaustion. He looked like a man who had been to hell and back. She was weak, but she was alive. "You're warm," she murmured. A sound escaped him, half sob, half laugh. He pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulder.
"The court,"
she whispered, the realization hitting her.
We missed it. Eli, we missed it."
"Shh," he said. "It don't matter." "But the land, Martin." He just looked at her. He saw the life in her eyes, the faint color returning to her cheeks. He had made his choice. He had chosen this. He had chosen her. He leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated possession. It was a promise. It was an answer. "We'll live," he said, his voice rough. He pulled her close, his hand cradling the back of her head, holding her as if he would never let her go. "That's all. We'll live." They rode into Split Rock well past noon. A full 3 hours after the court was meant to convene, the storm had finally broken, leaving the world scoured and silent, buried under a blinding, heavy blanket of white. The horses were spent, their heads hung low, their sides heaving, plastered in ice. Mary Lou swayed in the saddle, weak from the cold and the exhaustion. But she was alive. Eli, his face a raw, wind-burned mask of grim determination, slid from his horse and came to help her down. His hands were steady on her waist. Father Miguel, his old face etched with a deep, bone-weary cold, slid from his mule, his black robe stiff with frost. The main street was deserted. The entire town, it seemed, had crammed itself into the only building large enough to hold them and warm enough to keep them from freezing, the Silver Dollar Saloon. Eli pushed open the batwing doors. A wall of hot, sour air hit them, the smell of wet wool, stale whiskey, and unwashed bodies. The room was packed, shoulder to shoulder. At the far end, where the piano usually sat, a long table had been set up. Judge Hemlock sat behind it, his face pinched and bored. Sheriff Clanton stood beside him, a smug, satisfied look on his face. And on his feet, in the center of the cleared space, was Martin Hayes. He was dressed in his fine Eastern suit, his bowler hat in his hands. He was speaking, his voice oily and confident. And as this document, notarized and filed in the state of Ohio, clearly states, Martin was saying, holding up his will, "I, Martin Hayes, am the sole and rightful heir. The woman known as Mary Lou Hayes, who is in fact my runaway cousin, Clara May Hayes, has no legal claim. She is unwell, unstable, prone to delusions. She forged the previous document, Your Honor, just as she has lived a lie for this past year." "That's a lie." Mary Lou's voice, though weak, cut through the saloon. The entire room turned. The crowd murmured and parted, a sea of hostile, curious faces. They saw Eli Carver, looking like a ghost returned from the grave, caked in ice. They saw the half-frozen woman, and they saw the old, snow-dusted priest. Clanton's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of pure anger. Martin's face went pale. Judge Hemlock banged his gavel on the table. "You're late, Carver. We convened at 9 o'clock. In your absence. I have been hearing Mr. Hayes's testimony." "We were trapped by the storm," Eli said. His voice was a low rasp. "We rode all night. We brought our own witness." Clanton laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A witness? Who? That drunk pastor you hired? He's gone. Carver, and his church conveniently burned to the ground. You've got nothing." "We have Father Miguel," Eli said, stepping aside, "of the Wind River Mission." Father Miguel stepped forward. He was a small man, old and frail, but he moved with a quiet, undeniable authority. The room, which had been buzzing, fell quiet. Even Hemlock sat up straighter. A priest was a different matter. "Your Honor," the priest said, his voice clear and accented. "My name is Father Miguel Ortega. I am here to speak to the character of Mr. Elias Carver." "Proceed, Father," Hemlock said, his voice clipped. "But make it brief. This is a land dispute, not a revival meeting." The priest stood in the center of the room. He did not look at the judge. He looked at the crowd. "I knew Elias Carver in Texas," he began. "I knew him at the lowest moment of his life. I saw him brought to a tree, a rope around his neck, to be hanged by a mob for a crime of vengeance." The room inhaled. Men leaned in. "This man," the priest continued, pointing a steady finger at Eli, "hunted 3 men and killed them. This is true. What the mob did not care to know was that those 3 men had, the week before, formed their own mob. They had taken Mr. Carver's younger brother, Benjamin, a boy of 19, and hanged him for stealing a horse he had already paid for." A low murmur. This was new. "Elias Carver sought justice when the law would give him none," the priest said, his voice rising. "He did what any man of honor, any brother, would do. I stood between him and the rope. I told the hangmen that if they hanged him, they must hang me, too. And in that moment, God showed his hand. The rope, it broke. An act of providence." He turned to Hemlock. "This is not a man of fraud, Your Honor. This is not a man who deceives. He is a man of deep, if terrible, honor. He is a man who understands justice in his very bones. I would trust him with my life. You should trust him with this land." The priest finished. The silence in the saloon was absolute. Judge Hemlock tapped his fingers on the table. He looked at Clanton, then at Eli. "That is all very moving. Father, a fine sermon. But character is not collateral, and honor does not make a forged document legal." He waved a dismissive hand. "We are here to discuss a deed, not a man's soul. Your testimony is noted and irrelevant. You are dismissed." The hope that had flickered in the room died. Clanton's smirk returned. Martin Hayes looked triumphant. "Wait!" Mary Lou stepped forward. She was trembling, not from cold, but from a terrifying, final clarity. Eli moved to stop her, but she put a hand on his arm. "I will testify," she said. Hemlock sighed, impatient. "Very well. Mrs. Carver. Or is it Miss Hayes? State your name for the court." Mary Lou walked to the center of the room. She stood before the table. She looked at Martin. She looked at Clanton. Then she looked at the judge. "My name," she said, her voice clear, "is Clara May Hayes." The crowd gasped. It was one thing for Martin to accuse her. It was another for her to admit it. "Martin, my cousin, he told you the truth. Part of it." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "Back in Ohio, I fell in love with a preacher's son. I became with child. He abandoned me. My father, a powerful man, said I had tainted the family name. He said I was unclean. He cast me out." She was not looking at anyone now, just at the memory. "I had the baby, a little girl. She died in St. Louis, in a cold room, because I had no money, because I was alone." She was crying now, silent tears that ran down her face, but her voice did not waver. "I have been running ever since. I lied about my name. I lied about being a widow. I forged the will from my uncle. Yes, I did. I needed a new life. I needed a place to stop." The courtroom was so quiet. The only sound was the crackle of the stove and the drip of melting snow from the ceiling. "And when I got here," she continued, "and Sheriff Clanton and Judge Hemlock told me I couldn't keep the land unless I was married, I lied again. I went to this man." She turned, her eyes finding Eli's. He was watching her, his face carved from stone, his gray eyes blazing. I offered him a deal, a fake marriage, half the land if he would help me hold it. That, too, was a lie. I used him, just as I used my uncle's name. I did what I had to do to stay alive." She turned back to Judge Hemlock, her body shaking, her face wet with tears, but her spine rigid. "But it is not a lie anymore. This man, who everyone here fears, he stayed. He protected me. He shared his warmth when I was freezing. He shared his past when I was hiding. He risked his life to find the priest who could save him. I came here only to survive." She took a shaky breath, her gaze locking with Eli's across the room. "He taught me how to live." The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Judge Hemlock stared at her, his usual disinterest gone, replaced by a look of stunned confusion. Clanton looked uneasy. Martin Hayes, his face a mottled, furious purple, saw the judge's expression. He saw the way the crowd was looking at him, not with sympathy, but with a new, dawning contempt. His plan was unraveling. Her shame was supposed to condemn her, but it had, instead, made her reel. You whore!" he screamed, his voice breaking. "You filthy, lying harlot! You shamed us! You shamed us all!" He lunged. He was not lunging at Eli. He was lunging at her. His hand was raised, his face contorted in a mask of pure hatred, intending to strike her from the stand. He never reached her. Eli had been simmering, a pot of water held just below the boil. He had stood still while they insulted his honor, questioned his marriage, and dismissed his priest. But this was the one thing he would not abide. He moved. He did not draw his pistol. He did not make a sound. He was pure, kinetic rage. He crossed the 10 feet between them in a single, blurring movement. He hit Martin not with his fist, but with his forearm. A brutal blow to the throat that cut off the scream and sent Martin staggering backward, gasping. Before Martin could recover, Eli grabbed the front of his fine wool coat. Bunching it in his fist, he hit him in the stomach. The sound was a sickening, wet thud that echoed in the silent room. Martin gagged, his eyes wide with shock. Eli hit him in the face. A spray of blood, the crunch of bone. He hit him again and again. He was holding Martin up by the lapels, his other fist drawn back for the final blow, the one that would crush his skull, the one that would end it. The room exploded into chaos. Women screamed, men shouted. Clanton had his gun out, leveling it at Eli's back. "Carver, stop! In the name of the law! That's murder!" Eli paused. His arm was trembling with the sheer animal need to finish it. He stared into Martin's ruined, bloody, unconscious face. He thought of Ben, hanging from that tree. He thought of the 3 men he had hunted down. "Eli!" Mary Lou's voice. It was sharp, pleading. "Eli, no, please!" He heard her. Through the red haze of his rage, he heard her. He looked across the room. He saw her, her hands clasped to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. He saw Father Miguel, his hands clasped in prayer. He let go. Martin Hayes fell to the floorboards in a boneless, bloody heap. He was breathing, a ragged, wet rattle, but he was finished. Eli Carver stood over him, his chest heaving, his breath pluming in the hot air. His knuckles were split and bleeding. He turned, slowly, his hands open at his sides. He faced Judge Hemlock. He did not surrender. He did not run. He just waited. "Order!" Hemlock roared, banging his gavel so hard the wood cracked. "Order in this court! Sheriff, put that pistol away, now!" Clanton, stunned by the raw violence, hesitated. "Your Honor, he assaulted this man. He resisted." "I saw what happened," Hemlock snapped. He stood up, his small body rigid with a new, surprising authority. "I saw Mr. Hayes attack a witness on the stand. I saw Mr. Carver defend his wife." He looked down at Martin, who was groaning on the floor, being helped by 2 men. He looked at Eli, who stood calm and lethal. He looked at Mary Lou, who was crying but had not backed down. Judge Hemlock was a corrupt man, but he was not a stupid one. He had seen a performance of lies from Martin, and a performance of raw, terrible truth from Mary Lou. More than that, he had just seen Eli Carver almost kill a man with his bare hands and then stop on a word. He understood, in that moment, that pushing Eli Carver any further was a very, very bad idea. "This court," Hemlock announced, his voice carrying, "has heard two claims. Mr. Hayes," he glanced at the bloody man being dragged away, "has presented a will, but his behavior has cast serious doubt on his character." He picked up Martin's papers, and then Mary Lou's. "Frankly, both of these documents look questionable. I suspect both are forgeries, meant to swindle this court." "But, Judge," Clanton protested. "However," Hemlock silenced him, "Mrs. Carver, or whatever her name is on the land. She has occupied it. She has improved it, and—" his gaze hardened. "She is, by all appearances, legally married to a resident of this territory." He banged the gavel. "The challenge is dismissed. The claim filed by Jedediah Stone stands, as held by his heir, Mrs. Carver." Clanton's jaw dropped. "Your Honor, the fraud! The conspiracy—" "What fraud?" Hemlock snapped. "I heard a woman confess her sins to God in this court, not a conspiracy. I heard a priest vouch for a man's honor. I saw a relative attack her. What I didn't see was any proof of fraud. I saw a marriage, a messy one, perhaps, but a marriage all the same." He glared at Clanton. "And I would be very careful, Sheriff, about harassing a legal, land-owning resident. The territorial marshal might be very interested to hear about a sheriff who uses his office to intimidate citizens, or to look into his books." The threat was unmistakable. Clanton's face went white with fury, then pale with fear. He said nothing. "Court adjourned," Hemlock said. He looked at Martin, who was leaning against the bar, holding a bloody rag to his face. "Mr. Hayes, I strongly suggest you take the next train east before Mr. Carver changes his mind." Martin gave Mary Lou one last look of pure, venomous hatred. Then he slunk out of the saloon, defeated. Eli and Mary Lou walked out. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and a new, wary respect. Father Miguel followed them into the clean, cold air. The sun on the fresh snow was dazzling, blinding. They stood by their tired horses. "You should go, Father," Eli said, his voice rough. He was looking at his own bloody, trembling hands. "It's a long ride back, and thank you." "God be with you, Elias," the priest said. He turned and placed a hand on Mary Lou's shoulder. "And you, my daughter, you were braver than any man in that room. You taught them what truth looks like." He mounted his mule, gave them a single nod, and began his slow journey north. They were alone. The street was quiet. Mary Lou looked at Eli's hands. We should find a cloth for your hands." "It'll keep," he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the ground. She looked down, too, at the deep, clean snow at her feet. "Well," she said, her voice small, almost lost in the vast quiet. "You did it. We won. I have the land." She took a breath. It was the hardest one she had ever taken. The deal was you get half for helping me. You've earned it. Eli, you've earned more than that, but you can leave now, if you want." He still didn't look up. "The deal is done," she whispered, her heart breaking. "You're free. I'm not trying to push you away. After all this, you deserve a choice. You deserve peace." He was quiet for a long, long time. He looked up the street, toward the open, frozen plains. He looked down at his ruined hands. Slowly, he took off his hat. his fingers gripping the brim. He held it for a moment. Then he dropped it. The hat fell into the snow at his feet. "I didn't come for the land. Mary Lou," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. She looked up, her breath catching, her heart stopping. He was finally looking at her, his gray eyes stripped bare of all their walls, all their stone. "When I saw you," he said, "in that land office, and then in the saloon, I saw a woman, just like me, running, hiding. I told myself it was about the acres, a place to build a wall." He stepped closer. He reached out, not with his bloody, broken hand, but with his clean one. His calloused fingers brushed her cheek, wiping away a tear she hadn't known was falling. "I came," he said, his voice raw, "because I couldn't bear to let you stand alone." She let out the breath she'd been holding, a sound that was half sob, half laugh. She rose up on her toes, her cold hands coming up to frame his scarred, beautiful face, and she kissed him. He kissed her back, his arms coming around her, pulling her tight, lifting her off her feet. It was not the desperate, fearful kiss of the night before. It was not the hungry, angry kiss from the storm. It was a kiss of arrival. It was slow and deep and sure. It was a promise, made and kept, under a vast Wyoming sky streaked with snow and brilliant, cleansing light. He finally pulled back, resting his forehead against hers. "Let's go home," he whispered. He bent down, picked up his hat, and slapped the snow from its brim. He put it on his head. He took her hand, not her wrist, not her arm, her hand. His bloody, calloused fingers laced through hers. They mounted their tired horses and rode out of Split Rock. They left the town, the court, and their pasts behind them. They rode north, hand in hand, toward the cabin that was, finally, truly theirs. The snow did not just melt, it surrendered. It was not a gentle thaw, but a full-scale rout. A warm wind, a chinook, came over the high peaks, and in 3 days, the world was transformed. The sound of the plains was no longer the high, thin scream of the wind, but the deep, gurgling sound of a world unbound, of water moving, of earth breathing. The frozen, white silence was broken by the drip of water from the eaves, the crack of ice on the creek, and the smell of wet soil and pine. They had survived. The winter, Clanton, the court, the ghosts, they had survived. The cabin, which had been their prison, now became their anchor. They stepped outside into the warm, muddy air, and for the first time, it did not feel like a foray into enemy territory. It felt like walking onto their own land. The quiet life they had bargained for began to take root. It was a life defined by labor, but it was a different kind of work. It was not the desperate, frantic labor of survival, but the slow, hopeful labor of building. Eli taught her how to repair the fence line. He showed her how to brace a corner post, how to use the heavy tamping rod, his body moving with an easy, powerful rhythm. She worked beside him, her hands, already calloused, growing stronger. Their silences were different now. They were no longer the tense, watchful voids of their first weeks, but the comfortable, easy quiet of two people who understood each other. One morning, she caught him looking at the old, leaning barn. It had barely survived the winter's weight. "It won't last another," he said. "Then we build a new one," she replied. He looked at her, a small, surprised smile touching his scarred mouth. "Just like that?" "Just like that," she said, handing him his coffee. "We have the timber. We have the time." So they built. He felled the trees on the high ridge, the thwack of his axe echoing in the clear spring air. He skidded the logs down to the flat ground beside the ruined barn. Together, they stripped the bark, the sweet, sharp smell of pine sap filling their days. It was back-breaking work. He sawed, his muscles bunching and releasing. She hammered, her arm aching, until the rhythm of it was as natural as breathing. They were not just building a barn. They were building a life, stake by stake, nail by nail. When they were low on nails, and their stores of flour and coffee were finally gone, it was Mary Lou who spoke first. "I'll ride into town," she said. He stopped his work, the ads in his hand. "We'll go together." "No," she said, her voice firm, but not unkind. "I'll go. I have eggs to sell. Our chickens, they've been busy." He understood. This was a line she had to walk herself. He watched her ride out, her back straight, her head high. He did not know that he was holding his breath until she disappeared over the first ridge. Split Rock had not changed, but the way it saw her had. When she walked into Henderson's general store, the pot-bellied stove cold for the first time in 6 months. The conversation did not just stop, it froze. Mr. Henderson, who had once looked at her with indifference, now wiped his hands on his apron and hurried to the counter. "Mrs. Carver," he said, the name sounding respectful, if a little nervous. "What can we do for you?" "I have eggs, Mr. Henderson," she said, placing the basket on the counter. 6 dozen. I'd like to trade for them. I need flour, salt, coffee, and a keg of nails." He counted the eggs. He did the math. "That's fair, more than fair. We'll set you up." The whispers followed her as she moved through the aisles. She heard them. "That's her, Carver's wife. The one who cried in court. Heard she faced down her cousin. The one who, Eli Carver beat half to death." "She's the one who shot the arsonist. That's what I heard. Shot him right in the shoulder." A woman, Mrs. Davies, the banker's wife, who would have cut her dead on the street 2 months ago, was standing by the bolts of calico. She met Mary Lou's eyes. She did not smile, but she gave a single, stiff, respectful nod. Mary Lou nodded back. She rode home with her saddlebags full, not just of supplies, but of something else. She had not been treated as an outcast. She had not been treated as a friend. She had been treated as a force. She was Mrs. Carver, owner of the stone claim, a woman who had survived. When she topped the ridge and saw Eli waiting for her by the half-built barn, she kicked her horse into a trot. The relief that washed over her was so profound it almost made her weak. He did not ask how it went. He just looked at her face, saw the quiet victory there, and lifted the heavy saddlebags from her horse. The barn was finished in late May. The last rafter was set, the last shingle nailed. It was a fine, strong building, smelling of new pine and hard work. That night, they built a bonfire, using the rotted wood of the old barn. The flames leaped high against a sky so clear it looked like polished black stone, littered with 1,000,000 diamonds. They sat on a log, sharing a bottle of whiskey, the heat warm on their faces. Eli was quiet, staring into the flames. He had been quiet all day. "What is it?" she asked, touching his arm. He looked at her. The firelight softened the scar on his cheek, made his gray eyes seem deep and warm. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low. "All this land, this house, this barn, it feels—" He struggled for the word. "It's the first place that's ever felt like mine." He stood up. He held out his rough, calloused hand. "What?" she asked, smiling. "Dance with me," he said. "There's no music, Eli." "There's the fire," he said, "and the stars. It's enough." She placed her hand in his. He pulled her to her feet, his other hand settling on her waist, drawing her close. She rested her head on his shoulder. They moved slowly in the dirt, a simple, shuffling dance, turning in the golden light of the fire. He held her as if she were precious, his touch sure and gentle. He stopped moving, but he didn't let her go. He rested his cheek against her hair. "I don't feel fake anymore, Mary Lou," he whispered, his voice thick. "For so long, I was just the man with the scar, the man who killed, the man who was hanged. It was all I was, I wasn't a real person. Not anymore. She pulled back, just enough to look up at his face. She cupped his jaw, her thumb tracing the puckered line of his scar. You never did, Eli, she whispered. Not to me. You were the only real thing I'd found. He kissed her then. It was a long, slow, deep kiss, full of a quiet, settled peace. It was a kiss that held the promise of 1,000 more nights just like this. The peace lasted 3 days. They were a mile from the cabin, checking the northern fence line where the creek had run high. When the smell reached them, it was the wrong kind of smoke. Not the clean scent of their own chimney, but an oily, acrid stench. Eli went still. He looked up, sniffing the air. Then he looked toward the cabin. No, he breathed. He was already running for the horses. Mary Lou followed. They topped the ridge, and her world ended. It was not the barn. It was the cabin, their home. It was an inferno, black smoke and angry. Orange flames were pouring from the windows, licking at the sky. Mary Lou! Eli roared. Vaulting into his saddle, they galloped. A frantic, desperate race, their hearts pounding with the hoofbeats. As they cleared the trees, they saw him. He was standing between the burning cabin and the new, pristine barn, Martin Hayes. He was drunk, his fine clothes in tatters, his face a ruin of half-healed bruises and fresh cuts. He held a bottle in one hand and a lit torch in the other. He was laughing, a high, broken, insane sound that carried over the roar of the fire. If I can't have it, he shrieked, his voice a drunken slur. Then you can't have it. You think you can shame me? You think you can steal from me? You filthy, unclean! The cabin roof groaned, then collapsed inward, sending a volcano of sparks and embers into the twilight. Eli! Mary Lou screamed. Eli hauled on his reins, pulling his horse back. He was staring at the flames, then at Martin. His face was a terrible mask of pure, white-hot rage. Sss, get back! Eli pulled her from her horse, shoving her behind him. The fire! It's moving to the barn! The animals! Martin saw them, his ruined face twisted. Yes, the barn! Too! Everything! Everything you built! He drew back his arm and threw the torch. It arced through the air, landing in the dry patch of grass between him and the new barn. The grass caught instantly, a line of fire snaking toward the pine walls. No! Eli roared. He did not go for Martin. He went for the fire. He grabbed the empty water buckets from the well. The horses! Mary Lou, get the horses out of the pasture. Get them down to the creek. He ran to the well, his movements economical, his rage channeled into the single, desperate purpose of saving what was left. Mary Lou was frozen for a second, watching the man who had ruined her life, who was now ruining the only home she had ever known. Martin was laughing, backing away, his victory complete. He turned to slink off into the growing darkness, a shadow of malice. He wasn't going to get away. She had been carrying the rifle, as she always did when they checked the fences. She did not think, she just acted. She raised the Winchester. She braced it against her shoulder, just as Eli had taught her. She planted her feet. She sighted down the barrel, finding the shadow of his fleeing form. She did not aim for his back. She did not aim to kill. She aimed for his shoulder. She squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the roar of the fire. Martin screamed, a high, thin sound, and pitched forward, clutching his arm, writhing on the ground. Eli stopped, the full bucket sloshing in his hands. He stared at her. She stood in the firelight, her face grim, the rifle smoking at her side. He wasn't going to get away, she said, her voice cold and flat. Eli gave her a single, sharp nod. It was a look of terrible, profound understanding. Then he turned and threw the water on the creeping line of grass fire. They fought the fire for hours. They were two small figures against an apocalypse, choking on smoke, their eyes streaming, their arms aching. They lost the cabin. It was a pile of glowing, smoking ash.
But they saved the barn. They saved the animals. They saved the pasture.
At dawn, they were still standing, leaning on each other, covered in soot, their faces streaked with sweat and tears. They were staring at the smoldering ruins of their home. Martin Hayes was tied, groaning, to a fence post. That was how Sheriff Clanton found them. He rode up with 2 deputies, his face grim. He had seen the pillar of smoke from town. He took in the scene, the smoldering cabin, the saved barn, the 2 exhausted, soot-blackened survivors, and the man tied to the post, his shoulder a bloody rag.
"Carver,"
Clanton said, his voice holding no triumph, only a deep weariness. "What happened here?"
"He did,"
Eli said, his voice a dead rasp. He pointed at Martin.
"He said it. Arson. Tried to burn us out."
"I shot him," Mary Lou said, her voice just as flat.
"He was running."
Clanton dismounted. He walked over to Martin, who was now weeping, begging, the fight and the whiskey gone, leaving only a pathetic, broken man. Clanton looked at him, then back at Eli and Mary Lou. The entire town had heard what happened in that courtroom. They knew Martin was a liar. They knew Mary Lou had been vindicated. They knew Eli Carver had stopped short of killing him. Clanton was trapped. Judge Hemlock's warning was still fresh. If he let Martin go, if he tried to spin this, he would be run out of the territory. The tide had turned. He sighed, a long, frustrated sound. He jerked his chin at his deputies. "Cut him loose. Tie his hands. He's under arrest for arson and attempted murder." The deputies, who had once looked at Eli with fear, now looked at him with something bordering on awe. They hauled Martin to his feet. The town had finally, and fully, turned against him. He was no longer a respectable man from the East. He was a criminal. They rode away, leaving Eli and Mary Lou alone with the ruins. They did not speak. They just stood. They had nothing left but the barn, the land, and each other. The next day, a wagon appeared on the ridge. Eli's hand went to his gun, but he stopped. It was not Clanton. It was Mr. Henderson from the general store. His wagon was loaded with fresh-cut lumber. "Morning, Carver, ma'am," he said, pulling up. He didn't meet their eyes. "Heard you had some trouble. Judge Hemlock, he sends his regrets. He said this was a disgrace. He organized a collection for the lumber." Before they could even respond, another wagon appeared. It was Mrs. Davies, the banker's wife, and 2 other women. They brought a crate of tinned food, fresh bread, and 3 hot pies.
"A body needs to eat,"
"Mrs." Davies said stiffly, but her eyes were kind. By noon, there were 4 more wagons. Men from the town, men who had whispered about Eli in the saloon. They brought tools. They brought their labor. They did not come as friends. They came as neighbors. They had not been accepted as one of them. They had been recognized as survivors. In this land, that was more than respect. It was currency. They had faced down the law, the winter, and now fire. They had bled for this land. They had earned their place. They rebuilt. The townsfolk helped raise the new frame, and in 2 days, the cabin was framed again, stronger this time, with wood from the town. Weeks later, the new cabin was almost finished. The porch was built. The roof was on. It smelled of new pine and fresh earth. It was evening. Mary Lou was standing on the new porch, her hands resting on the rail. The sun was setting, painting the high plains in shades of purple and gold. The land was green, lush with new spring. She heard Eli's boots on the steps. He came up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder. They stood in the comfortable quiet, watching the day end. He had felt her stillness. She had been quiet all day, a pensive inward quiet he had learned to read. "What is it?" he murmured, his lips brushing her hair. She said nothing. She just covered his hands with her own, pressing them lower, against her flat stomach. He felt it, the slight, almost imperceptible tension in her.
"Eli,"
she said, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the breeze.
I've been counting. It's been some time. I think I might be pregnant."
He went still. The man who had faced down fire and mobs. The man who had survived a hanging. He just stopped breathing. The world stopped. Slowly, he turned her around, his hands on her waist. He searched her face, his gray eyes wide, full of a terrifying, stunning vulnerability. "Mary Lou?" She looked up at him, her own eyes shining with unshed tears. She was smiling, a small, wobbly, terrified, joyous smile.
I'm almost sure."
His face, the shock, the stun, it melted. Like the spring thaw, it broke apart, and something new came through. A slow dawning smile, a real, unguarded smile, crinkled the corners of his eyes and softened his scar. He looked stunned. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since Texas. He kissed her. His first kiss was gentle, almost reverent. His calloused, scarred hand came up to cup her cheek, as if she were made of glass. Then he kissed her again. A fierce, powerful kiss, full of possession, of joy, of a future he had never, ever allowed himself to imagine. He pulled her tight against him, lifting her off her feet, burying his face in her neck, his body shaking with the force of his emotion. He set her down and, without a word, took her hand and pulled her toward the new door of their new home. She stopped him, just at the threshold. She put her free hand on his chest, feeling the wild, rapid beat of his heart. She looked up into his eyes. "No more pretending," she whispered. He kissed her hand, his eyes never leaving hers. "No more," he said, his voice raw. He pulled her inside, into the warm, safe darkness of the home they had built from ashes. The door shut behind them.
Outside,
the wind howled softly over the high, empty plains. Inside, everything was finally warm. Thank you so much for listening to our story. I truly hope you enjoyed it. We would love to hear from you. Please take a moment to comment and let us know where in the world you are listening from. If you enjoyed this, be sure to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories just like this one. And finally, what did you think of Eli and Mary Lou? We would love to read your thoughts, so please share them with us in English.